welcome you to Science Study Break. This is Science Study Break number 10. So if you've been to previous programs, welcome back. And if you just started, welcome, and watch this space because there will be more programs in the spring. This is a program, in case you've seen or haven't had the opportunity to visit our website where we talk about it, this is a program where we look at science movies, science TV shows, and we have a UT faculty member come in and talk about the science in these programs. Is it good science? Is it bad science? Is it a little bit of both, which is what you find a lot of the time? And then they talk about what's accurate, and then I talk a little bit about library resources that you might use if you wanted to check up on this sort of program. We've had programs in the past where somebody looked at an episode of CSI and he had actually been called as an expert witness in a murder trial, attempted murder trial, and he talked about it because it was an episode that had been ripped from the headline of the trial where he was the expert witness. We've had a program where we looked at several episodes of the TV show House. Everybody watch House? People do, okay. Well, I hope you were here for that. If not, come on in. You know, we're going to be putting these things up on our website as podcasts in the happy fullness of time. And so we've had shows where somebody came in and talked about spider science, and we looked at scenes from several of the Spider-Man movies. So we pretty much look at popular culture and the science in it, and we look at, a lot of times, what you want. You notice that all of your chairs have some white feedback forms in there, so please don't leave without filling out the form. You've got a form and a pencil available to you, and we do operate off of people's suggestions. People have suggested programs in the past that we should do, and I'm happy to report that in the spring we anticipate doing the program Numbers. If anyone watches that TV show, we've had lots of requests for that, so that's something that will be coming along. We do 2 programs each long session, 2 in the fall and 2 in the spring. So please leave your suggestions. I will say that if you're suggesting that we do the TV show Lost, tell me what the approach would be. Give us some help, because there's been a lot of call for that, but I can't quite figure out how to approach that program. So do give us some help with that. Okay. The legalese. Okay. We are recording this. It will eventually be on our website where everybody can see it. You know, if you're in witness protection, it's time to go now because you're going to be on the video, okay? All right, then in that case, let's get ready for tonight's program, which is Gattaca. This is a 1997 science fiction movie with Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman. It's where they met. Okay. How many have seen Gattaca? Okay, quite a few have seen this. I thought this was a really good movie. It was written and directed by a guy named Andrew Niccol. He also did The Truman Show. He did a movie called Simone, where like the I and the O were a 1 and a 0. She was this constructed person. He also did The Terminal, which was, he wrote that, and it was directed by Steven Spielberg, the one where Tom Hanks is the stateless person in the airport. So he does a lot of movies that touch on identity issues and one's personhood. And he's actually currently writing, and this is really good news if you like these works he's done, he is currently writing the screenplay for the 2011 remake that Ridley Scott is doing of Brave New World. So that's really good news. I think that's good news. Those are 2 people I think will make a great production. Okay? So as we get into this, for those of you who haven't seen Gattaca, Stuart here is going to set it up and let you know just kind of what's the story, what it's about. So let me tell you about him. Stuart's had a long career here at UT. He did his undergrad here, and then he came back for his PhD in Dr. Stan Rue's lab, where he was studying the regulation of plant growth by light. After he got his PhD, he lived in Cuernavaca, Mexico for a year, working at the Institute of Biotechnology, part of the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. And he came back to UT in 2001 to teach and to do research on the role of extracellular ATP as a signaling molecule in plants. He's taught introductory biology, biology for non-majors, genetics. He's taught a Dean's Scholars Seminar on science ethics, and now he teaches a research methods class for the Freshman Research Initiative. And on a side note, he is, I'm very happy to say, a person who's converted from a Science Study Break attendee to a Science Study Break presenter. Okay? So please welcome him to the program. Slideshow.
Okay, so for those of y'all that haven't seen Gattaca, let me tell you a little bit about it. And then for each, we're going to see a bunch of film clips tonight. And I'll tell you a little bit about the setup for each film clip, because we're not actually going to see them in order of the movie. We're going to see them a little bit out of order. So, as Roxanne said, this movie was made in 1997, and it's a near-future science fiction movie where DNA sequencing has become very inexpensive, and so people and companies are using people's DNA sequence as a way to judge individuals. So, Ethan Hawke, who's the star of the movie, and Uma Thurman, so he's what's called a godchild. So his parents didn't use sequencing or in vitro fertilization techniques that are common at the time this movie is set to produce him. So like everybody, he's got genetic defects. And so those genetic defects are used to discriminate against him. And so the basic plot of the movie is he decides he's not going to put up with that. What he really wants to do is be an astronaut. And the astronaut company who's sending people into space, of course, won't take him. So what he does, and we'll see some scenes about this later on, is he borrows somebody else's DNA with that person's permission. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And so he's able to infiltrate this company called Gattaca and then try to become an astronaut and make it out into space. So there's three main things we're going to talk about. So, and this is more or less the order we'll talk about them in. So we'll talk some about the technology, and this is the reason we're not going to see the clips necessarily in order, because I've grouped them together sort of by subject as opposed to time of the movie. And like I said, I'll try to set up the different scenes. So first we'll talk a little about the technology. And as I started putting together this presentation, I was actually pretty surprised to find out that we're a lot closer than I ever imagined to be able to doing some of these things that they talk about in this movie. Of course, I knew about sequencing and how the price of sequencing is coming down and some things like this, but there's been some recent advances and some recent companies and research on the ability of looking at people's DNA and trying to figure out what's going on. So we'll talk some about the technology, some of the things in the movie, some of the things that are happening now. And then I want to talk some about the ethics of doing this, sort of the pros and cons of looking at people's DNA, the possibilities of how realistic is this? Can we really use people's DNA? Can we make any valid judgments about somebody by looking at their DNA? And what are kind of some of the problems involved in that? And then lastly, going along with this idea of, well, if we're going to look at your DNA and try to make some decisions about you, well, we need to know a little bit about, well, how much information can I gather about you by looking at your DNA? So there's a big sort of dichotomy between what we believe to be our nature, the things, the DNA that we were born with, and then nurtured, which is our environment that we grew up in. And the pendulum seems to sort of swing back and forth. Back in the 70s, for instance, in prisons and places, there was a lot of rehabilitation programs, and there was this belief that by putting people in the correct environment, we could make really good people. And in some ways, that's the idea behind a university and lots of other things as well. Right? And then the pendulum sort of swung back, I don't know exactly when, maybe somewhere in the 80s or so, to this idea that, well, right, good people are made based on their genes. And now with these discoveries, right, it's hard to open up a newspaper, or who opens newspapers anymore, to look at Google News or Yahoo News or whatever and not see something about, right, well, this gene that does this and this gene that codes for this and whatever. So the pendulum's kind of swung back now. We've got this big focus on our genes and our DNA. And I'll talk a little more about this later in the talk, but we really can't separate these two things apart from each other. Our genes are dependent on the environment that they're expressed in, and the way we perceive the environment and the way we interact with the environment is dependent on the DNA that we have. So there's really no way to separate those two things. And we'll talk about some of these things as we go through. All right. So, like I said, the first thing we're going to talk about is a few clips from the movie about the technology of getting DNA, looking at DNA, etc. And the first thing we're going to see is the very opening few minutes of the movie. So we'll see the clip and then we'll talk about it. And while Roxanne's pulling the clip up, I know some of y'all already know me, been in my classes or whatever, and you know I give pretty informal talks. So, of course, if y'all have comments or questions or whatever, as we're going through, please feel free to ask them. So I hope that besides just me talking, we'll also have some discussion and some things, because for some things I have definitive things to say or information to give, but other times we just have some questions or whatever. So most of the movie is sort of the time of the as the movie goes along, right? Most of it's not Quentin Tarantino showing the beginning at the end and the end at the beginning and whatever. But his very first scene is actually somewhere in the middle of the movie. So as I mentioned, the Ethan Hawke character that we just saw, so he's one of these people in the near future that didn't have their genes chosen for them. And that's keeping him from doing what he wants to do, which is be an astronaut. So as we'll see, he gets to borrow somebody else's DNA, somebody who has really good, so to speak, good DNA. And so as he gets his job, besides this ability to sequence people's DNA, so there's elaborate security set up based on people's DNA. And so what we see him doing in this first scene is he's getting rid of, or trying to get rid of, his DNA from hair that would fall off and other things. So, right? So this is one of a little bit of the inaccuracies. There's a couple places in the movie where they sort of, he and the Jude Law character who helps him, and this Jude Law's the one with the good DNA, where they go to great lengths to make sure that Ethan Hawke isn't caught. Like his DNA never shows up as actually him, only as the Jude Law character. So, of course, you see him shaving and care and wiping off skin cells and stuff in this first scene to try to make sure that none of his DNA gets out into the environment when he goes to his job at Gattaca, right? And of course, one of the problems here is, well, if you just go get your hair cut, right, you don't have to worry too much about your barber sequencing your DNA or looking at your DNA, because cut hair doesn't actually contain any DNA. It's dead skin cells, and they're dead cells, and it doesn't actually contain DNA. Of course, if you brush your hair and some of your hair falls off with the root hair has cells, and we can get DNA from that, right? But just a piece of hair in the middle without the root, we can't collect DNA from. And the same thing goes, he's in the shower there, like scrubbing his skin. I've always wondered in the movie why no one notices he has beautiful baby soft skin, because he's always scrubbing it all off. They don't seem to remark about that in the movie, right? But the same thing, the outside of our skin is dead cells. And we lose lots and lots of cells every day, right? Go fluff your pillows or your couch at home when you get home tonight. A lot of that's your dead skin cells. But once again, that doesn't contain DNA. So those cells that fall off, that can't give you away as far as DNA goes. And of course, one of the most common places to get DNA, especially crime scenes, is from blood. But it turns out it's not as easy as it seems. Because the red blood cells, which are most of your blood, the cells in your blood, they had DNA when they were developing into red blood cells. But once they're actually functioning for oxygen transport, there's no DNA in those cells. And you can't get DNA from them. The white blood cells, which are just a few thousand per milliliter of blood, those have DNA. So you can get DNA from those cells, but not from the red blood cells. So most of the DNA, well, most of the material in blood, you can't actually extract DNA from. Only the white blood cells, which is a pretty small percentage of your blood. Right? So a lot of the things he goes through to not be detected by his DNA in the movie really aren't necessary, because skin and hair and some of those things we can't really get DNA from. Okay. So this next scene, so as I said, his parents, they had him more or less by accident, without in vitro fertilization, without choosing genes for their son. And his name is Vincent in the movie. So they go to have a second child, and the second child they go to have, they decide, well, we're not going to take chances anymore, we're going to use this new technology. So here they're at the in vitro fertilization clinic, and they're meeting with the guy, and they're choosing their second child.
First, we may as well decide on gender. Have you given it any thought?
We would want Vincent to have a brother, to play with.
Of course you would. Hello, Vincent. You have specified hazel eyes, dark hair, and fair skin. I've taken the liberty of eradicating any potentially prejudicial conditions, premature baldness, myopia, alcoholism, and addictive susceptibility, risk for violence, obesity, etc.
We didn't want, diseases, yes, but...
Right, we were just wondering if it's good to just leave a few things to chance.
You want to give your child the best possible start. Believe me, we have enough imperfection built in already. Your child isn't needing additional burdens. And keep in mind, this child is still you. Simply the best of you.
So now we've got sort of the central conflict of the movie setup, right? We've got a bunch of people, for whatever reasons. In Vincent's case, it's not really clear from the movie why his parents didn't at the beginning do in vitro fertilization for him. And people who can't afford it, who can't afford to go to a fertilization clinic and get your embryos chosen for you, versus the people who are able to do this. And so, right, the way they have it set up in the movie, and the way this will eventually happen initially, is that we'll produce embryos via in vitro fertilization, and then go through, look at the DNA in those embryos, and choose which embryo you want to implant. And the problem is And the problem sort of in the technology of this from the movie is that, well, we have a lot of genes. So humans have around 25,000 genes, give or take. We're not exactly sure yet. And some of those genes actually code for more than one protein. So estimates are humans can produce about 85,000 different proteins. And so when we try to go in and we look, and we try to find somebody, more or less, who's perfect, who doesn't have defects, who won't have vision problems, hearing problems, heart problems, kidney problems, whatever, statistically, it's just not possible. With so many genes, right, even if we have thousands of embryos to choose from, certainly we can choose, right, certain ones we know, well, certain severe defects, we can say, okay, we're not going to choose that embryo. But the idea that based on all of these different genes and combinations of different genes, that by natural fertilization, taking sperm and eggs and putting them together and allowing them to fertilize, that we can find individuals who don't have defects. It's just not possible. There's just too many genes and too many variations of the different genes to make this possible.
Has anybody looked at variations within sperm cells to see, because there's a fair number of those that you can choose from to help the issue?
Right, so we can you can look at the sperm first. The problem is when you extract the information from the sperm, you destroy the cell. So what they do is they start the in vitro fertilization. And I'm supposed to give you a koozie for asking a question. Oh, bad shot. I need that cannon. I asked if they had a cannon I could shoot him out of.
Next time.
But they don't. So what they do is they do the in vitro fertilization. So this just came out recently. Roxanne actually found this for me and forwarded it to me. So this is a trial that's going on in England where they're taking DNA from an 8-day-old in vitro fertilized embryo. So when it's still a few hundred cells or so, they take one of those cells. But you can't do it to sperm or the egg itself because by extracting the information, you destroy the cell itself. And then they're also looking at the parents, and maybe depending on if they know there's already a defect or the parents have some genetic problems, they're looking at other relatives to try to figure out where the defect came from. And they're able to screen these embryos. This is what they're trying to do. They've just started this study. And pick the embryos that don't have defects. All right? So this cost, I think it's 1,500 pounds, which at least yesterday was $2,300. So of course there's an economic, right? And then in this article that talked about this new, this is a fertility clinic that's doing this in conjunction with some researchers, right? So of course, right, there's big defects we can look at and try to remove, but just like in the movie, it's a little spooky. All right, of course, if this technique is successful and it's already relatively cost effective, a few $1,000s to do, right? And they can screen, they have 15,000 different genetic defects they can look for, and as they expand that, as we expand our information, expand what we know about, they can expand what they're looking for and basically do what the scene in the movie was just talking about. Okay. So, all right, one of this idea about implementing the technology, changing the technology that we have, is, right, that this should make us feel safer, that things should be better. Right? Technology is supposed to help us. Right? When your computer loses your file and it blows up, that's supposed to make your life easier, not harder. Right? When the file's permanently lost or whatever.
I'm going to apologize right now because, of course, speaking of technology, I've had a technology failure with the software that I use here today. So something that worked yesterday is not quite working today, and I'm having to freehand my way to these scenes instead of being able to simply type in the time code and go to them. So bear with us, please.
For the genetically superior, success is easier to attain, but it is by no means guaranteed. After all, there is no gene for fate. And when, for one reason or another, a member of the elite falls on hard times, their genetic identity becomes a valued commodity for the unscrupulous. One man's loss is another man's gain.
His credentials are impeccable. An expiration date they wouldn't believe. The guy's practically gonna live forever. He's got an IQ off the register. Better than 20/20 in both eyes. In the heart of an ox. He could run through a wall. If he could still run. Actually, he was a big-time swimming star. Yes. You could go anywhere with this guy's helix tucked under your arm. What did I tell you? When you look so right together, I want to double my fee.
We don't look anything alike.
It's close enough. When was the last time anybody looked at a photograph? You could have my face on your name tag, for Christ's sake.
Okay.
So this is relatively early on in the movie. We've got Vincent, the godchild, and he's meeting the Jude Law character, this guy named Jerome, who has wonderful DNA, but has had an accident, and now he's in a wheelchair. So, right, this is the idea about, they talk there at the end, right? Of course, they don't actually look, they look a little bit similar, but not that similar, right? And so as technology increases, and now they're using DNA to screen people, we'll see some of the techniques they use to get around the DNA screening, right? What happens is people stop paying attention to other things. And we'll see another scene about this that comes up a little bit later in the movie as well, right? So there's things on our driver's license, of course, right? Our height, our hair, eye color, things like this, right? That we use as biometric data. When an officer pulls you over, they look at you, they see whether what's on your license or what's in your record matches who they're talking to, right? And then for foreigners who come in and out of the United States since 9/11, they collect biometric data. They take your picture, they take your fingerprint every time you come into the country, and that's on a database. So every time you go in and out, they use this biometric data, right? Things about your height, your weight, your photograph, your fingerprint, etc., to try to identify and make sure that no one's coming in and using somebody else's passport, right? I've always wondered when you go through, right, at a bar or across the country border, and they look at your picture and they look at you, like, who made them an expert in photo identification? Is that really me or is it not me, right? And so, of course, there's also increased surveillance. And one of the problems with increased surveillance, security cameras, etc., is, well, there's all this huge amount of data coming in. So now there's technologies and companies that are trying to be able to use that information and use that data, right, to identify where people are by photo recognition, body recognition, even people's gait, how you walk. Right? So they're trying to use this data and use this technology to improve security. And so in response to that, right, we've got the hoodie. Right? And this is an article from England, right? So it talked about how in this mall in England, it's a shopping mall, that the malls banned hoodies. Because that's what the bad, so I hadn't heard this term, the yobs. Apparently yob in England is another term for hooligans. Even the Prime Minister used the term yobbish. That was awesome. So anyway, these bad youths wearing hoodies, right, they're getting around the surveillance, right? You put it up from the back, you can't tell who it is. You put it up around the front of your face, and you can't be detected very easily. Right? So we move to have higher security, surveillance cameras, other biometric data, things like that, right? The baggy clothes and things like this, that make it hard to detect somebody by surveillance.
Yeah, a few years ago, I was a contractor overseas for the military, and before we left, they were taking our DNA in addition to our other biometrics to have the same in case something happened to us.
Right, in the military, I believe before people go into Iraq and Afghanistan and things like that, they take a DNA sample before you go. Okay, I don't know how to deliver this. I guess I could ask people to hand it back. Add a rock into it. Okay. So in this next scene, it's a little later on in the movie, and we're going to introduce the other main character besides Jude Law and Ethan Hawke, the two characters that are going to be sort of sharing DNA, as it were. And we're going to have Uma Thurman introduced. So she works at Gattaca, and she and who she thinks is Jerome, the Ethan Hawke character, they start to have a romantic interest together. And what she does is she gets a little bit of Jerome, some hair from a brush that has the root hair on it, and she takes him and she gets him sequenced. That's good right there. Pause it for a second, Roxanne. So I should mention that the Ethan Hawke character, he's actually places things, he gets hair from Jude Law and places it specifically around his desk, just in case they come and check, they'll get Jude Law's DNA and not his. So he meticulously cleans his desk every day, and then he takes packets that Jude Law's been preparing for him, and he spreads hair and cells and everything else around his work area, just in case something like this, not Uma Thurman, but the people at the company would try to test him. All right, thanks.
How old?
Me?
Specimen.
I kissed him 5 minutes ago. A real good one.
I'll see what I can do.
You want the full sequence?
Yes.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Right? So here we've got fly-by-night DNA sequencing. Right? It's gotten so cheap that you can just get somebody's, right, the second lady in there, she just kissed the guy, and they're getting some cells off of her lips and extracting, well, I'm assuming it's a guy, the DNA, right? And she's finding out who the person she's with, getting his or her DNA sequence and figuring it out, right? And Uma Thurman's doing the same thing, right? She got the hair with the hair follicle on it, and she gets him sequenced to look at his DNA, right? They're starting to have a romantic interest, and so she's trying to decide whether she's going to continue this romantic interest based on his DNA. And so what we can see is there's several companies who are working really hard to drive down the cost of DNA sequencing, right? So humans have a lot of DNA, 3 billion nucleotides. So there's a lot of work trying to drive down the cost of sequencing this. So this is just overall, we can see there's been a pretty rapid decrease in the cost. This is per nucleotide, basically. And estimates are, no one's been able to do this yet, but estimates are, in the next couple of years, the material cost to sequence somebody's complete genome will be around $1,000. And what they're going to be able to do then, what these companies are going to do is at a cost of $5,000, you send us some samples, we'll send you back your DNA, your complete DNA sequence. Right? And of course, the price is just going to continue to fall. So this idea of being able to sequence the DNA and make it cost effective is getting closer and closer. It's much closer than we thought it was.
But the sequence isn't really the information I'm looking for. There's a lot. You need the information to tell you what the sequence is.
Of course.
Is that included in the price?
That's a great question. I have no idea. I think that's just for the sequence itself, and then you got to figure out what's going to happen and who. So this next scene, once again, it comes back to this idea of sort of technology and security. And this is, if you guys haven't seen the movie, you're going to go see it. I'm going to ruin it a little bit for you. Spoiler alert. So this is near the end of the movie. So the Ethan Hawke character has gotten through all of the trials and tribulations, and he's managed to become an astronaut, and he's getting ready to be sent off into space. And he's been using fluids, blood and tissue and urine from the Jude Law character to make his way through and to pass all these tests, right? And so this is near the very end where he's about to go onto the ship. And there's a last P test that he's not ready for because they aren't traditionally doing this.
New policy. Blake got you nervous?
Well, there's a problem, Mark.
I never did tell you about my son, did I? He's a big fan of yours.
Just remember that I was as good as any. And better than most.
He wants to apply here.
I could have gone up and back and nobody would have been the wiser.
Unfortunately, my son's not all that they promised. But then who knows what he could do. Right? For future reference, right-handed men don't hold it with their left. It's one of those things. You don't miss your flight, Vincent.
So like I said, this is right at the very end of the movie. So throughout the whole movie, the Ethan Hawke character has had to go through all these trials and tribulations to fool the detection of his actual DNA. And that's the lab guy who's always there to take his urine samples and blood samples and whatever else, right? And he thinks he's been really smart, and he's outsmarted them all the way to the end until he shows up for his actual flight, and it turns out that, well, right, there's one last P test that he wasn't ready for. Turns out that the guy's been taking the tests. Well, he's known, we don't know for how long, for quite a long time, that he wasn't who he said he was, right? So we've got the guy running the technology, a relatively low-tech job of running this machine, and he's able to glob up the whole works, right? The guy who's in charge of taking the samples, well, he's faking it, right? He's manipulating the machine and allowing somebody who doesn't have the right DNA to make it in this Gattaca in the company, right? So as we add on layers of technology and surveillance and more people watching other people, right, we have the problem of sort of who's watching the watcher, right? And these breaches in security happen all the time. So this is one from just a couple days ago where this was reported in the Minnesota Star Tribune. They went to the local airport in Minneapolis. And what they did is they printed out their own boarding passes, faked them, upgraded themselves to first class, and then used that without any ID to get through the border checkpoint. Right? And in this case, they didn't need to bribe anybody or anything like this. With just some simple forged documents, they were able to circumvent our post 9/11 security. And this is another website where they try to track instances where people's private information, social security numbers, financial information, whatever, is given out in an unauthorized manner. Not one or two at a time, but thousands of records at a time. When people either hack in or when they're able to get that information in some way. And so their website's a little clumsy because they don't really have data by year. It's a little hard. But so since they've been doing this in 2005, they claim over 245 million sensitive documents have been illegally attained, right? And so some of those may be repeats that happen more than once or whatever. What we can see is, of course, right, that as we have more and more of this sensitive information, and more people have access to this sensitive information, right, then it's easier to have that sensitive information to get into people's hands that we'd rather not have it. Okay. So now we're going to start making the switch from the technology side of it and start talking about some of the ethics and some of these other things. So in this next clip, a murder occurs at this company, Gattaca. And the Ethan Hawke character, he has nothing to do with it. But what it means is suddenly there's a whole lot more scrutiny. And they go through and they start sweeping for DNA and they start looking for who's been here because they're trying to figure out who the murder suspect is. And so they're increasing their security. So what we're going to see is 2 police officers talking about, well, how they're going to try to catch the suspect by looking for people, unauthorized people's DNA.
Positive match. I'm impressed.
The cup was definitely used since the original sweep.
2 samples, 2 days. Either the suspect went back to the scene of the crime to get a drink of water, and I don't know anybody got thirsty, or he still works there.
I thought we checked all the service there.
I don't think he cleans up the place anymore. I have a feeling he might be there under false pretenses, playing somebody else's hand.
A borrowed ladder? At Gattaca.
It's far-fetched, but it's not out of the realm of possibility.
I find it hard to believe he could be one of their elite workers. Even if he got past their security system, he wouldn't have the mental faculty or the physical stamina.
Maybe you're underestimating. Maybe he is an imposter, and maybe the director found out about it. That could be his motive. I say we sample every employee within the parameters, intravenously.
2/3 of their workforce fall into that category. We'd be closing them down for days. No, a fingertip sample of urine should be sufficient.
I suggest blood from the vein. I hope I'm not out of line.
So the point I want to focus in from that scene is they know more or less what this person they're looking for, who's the Ethan Hawke character. They know more or less what he looks like, certain parameters they have, right? And the one officer, he says, well, that's 2/3 of their workforce, right? So what's happened is, of course, people are choosing the workforce. The elite workers are people whose DNA has been chosen by their parents. Well, everybody starts choosing the same things, right? So what we see is that the diversity, the genetic diversity of the workforce of these elite individuals begins to go down. And biologically, this is a very serious problem. So one of the things we worry about for species when they get to be a few in number, as species become endangered, is that they lose genetic diversity. And once the diversity, the genetic diversity, the different genes within that species gets too low, there's very little you can do to stop them from becoming extinct. So I have a quick example of this. So this is from the Atwater chicken prairie. And what we see here is the species is endangered. There's fewer and fewer number of the individuals. This is males. And what we see is this other is the percentage of eggs that hatch. And what we can see is in the early 90s, that percentage dropped precipitously. The number of individuals didn't change all that significantly, but the successful reproduction did change. It went way, way down. And what happened is there were fewer and fewer individuals, genetic diversity went down. Until, even though there were not a big sudden decrease in individuals, with less and less genetic diversity, they weren't able to continue to successfully reproduce. So what people did is they brought in individuals from another geographic location with other DNA, and that allowed reproduction to go back up and the population to recover. If we hadn't done this, not like I was involved, if this hadn't occurred, bringing in individuals with different DNA from a different geographic location, this local population of the chicken prairie would probably be extinct by now. Right? So as people are choosing genes, we see a decrease in genetic diversity. Okay, so this is, once again, we're back a little more at the beginning of the movie. And Vincent, the Ethan Hawke character, is talking a little bit about what life is like when your DNA wasn't chosen for you.
The only way that you'll see the inside of a spaceship is if you were cleaning it.
My father was right. It didn't matter how much I lied on my resume. My real resume was in my cells. Why should anybody invest all that money to train me when there are 1,000 other applicants with a far cleaner profile? Of course, it's illegal to discriminate. Genoism, it's called. But no one takes the law seriously. If you refuse to disclose, they can always take a sample from a door handle or a handshake, even the saliva on your application form. If in doubt, a legal drug test can just as easily become an illegal peek at your future in the company.
So here we've got Vincent's early adulthood dilemma, right? He doesn't have the ideal DNA, and he's applying for jobs and he's getting turned down. Jobs as working in the field of being an astronaut, right? So we've got this ability, which initially, even today, like the firm who's doing this in vitro fertilization and using these genetic screenings, right? We've got this technology that sounds wonderful, right? Who wants to have children that are going to die at age 20-something because of a heart problem or whatever, right? If we could reduce or eliminate genetic defects, we've got to decide what we're going to define as a genetic defect, right? But if we can reduce or eliminate what we think are defects, that sounds wonderful, right? But once we begin to unleash this technology, right, there's always another side to it, right? Nuclear power, of course, right? Even today, we're still arguing about whether nuclear power is good or bad, right? Nuclear bombs, I think most of us decide are a bad thing, especially when they're being dropped on us, right? But nuclear power, there's a big, huge debate about, is this the kind of power, is it clean, green, beautiful energy, or is it dangerous, right? And another technology that we've unleashed and has exploded over the last 12 years is genetically modified plants. So just 12 years ago, there was virtually none. You couldn't find them. And now worldwide, we have an area much greater than the size of the state of Texas that have been planted with these genetically modified crops. So we've got this new technology, the positive promises that are promised from these technologies, right? But once they get unleashed, like in the movie, once people are able to choose their offspring, we get this tiered system of people with good DNA and people with not so good DNA. Then we get the discrimination that comes in, right? Choosing which individuals, right? Job applications and other things having to do with your DNA. Oh, we're skipping this one, eh? Okay. So, in this next clip, sorry, I got to remind myself which one was about. So this is talking about what I already introduced it as. So here, the Ethan Hawke character is talking about sort of this division between the people with good DNA and the people with the so-so DNA. I'll talk a little about discrimination in general after this.
Blood sachets for security checks, and vials filled with other traces. While Eugene supplied me with a new identity, I paid the rent and kept him in the style to which he'd become accustomed. Eugene never suffered from the routine discrimination of a utero, a faith birth, or invalid, as we were called. A valid, a vitro, a made man. He suffered under a different burden, the burden of perfection. I was now a member of a relatively new and particularly detested segment of society. One of those who refuses to play the hand that he was dealt. I am most commonly known as a borrowed lad, or a degenerate.
Right? So, as a culture, not even here in the US, but as a culture in general, humans, we have this wonderful hobby where we like to divide things up, right? We do it, of course, scientifically, for those of y'all are biology majors, right? We've got this whole system of taxonomy. This goes in that group. We like to group things into little groups, right? And so we've got all these different things outside of the realm of biology. We group ourselves. We put ourselves in this group and we separate ourselves from that group, right? I forgot to put Longhorns and Aggies on this slide, right? But of course we divide ourselves in really ridiculous ways, right? And we love to use these divisions, right, as little daggers to kind of point at each other, So this is a quote from an editorial that came out last week or so when Colin Powell endorsed Barack Obama, right? This is from the Kansas City Star newspaper. Right, so Rush Limbaugh, of course, was mouthing off about Colin Powell's endorsement of Barack Obama. And this person who wrote this editorial in this newspaper said, well, of course that's what's going on, right? They're part of the same group. Of course they're in cahoots with each other. Right? So we've got this really weird sort of habit of dividing ourselves and making divisions. And a little bit later, I'll talk a little more about this and maybe some of the reasons where this comes from and why it happens and some of the things that lead to it. So this next scene's during the investigation of this murder, which, like I said, doesn't really directly have anything to do with our central character, Ethan Hawke, but on the side sort of does because he gets caught up in this sweep of DNA. So they come in and talk to the director of the company, Gattaca, who's Gore Vidal, by the way, and they're asking him about the people who work there.
Mr. Director, we'll be pleased to know that we have a suspect.
That is a relief. Who is it?
We found an unaccounted for specimen in the south wing, and here's his picture.
And invalid. We are still following on the leads.
Be that as it may, I'm having this posted immediately.
I'm curious, Director.
And an advantage, I should imagine, in your line of work.
Your hiring practices.
Recruitment, philosophy.
Who do you have to be here?
Well, naturally, our standard is beyond that of the common citizen.
Even amongst your people, you must have varying levels of excellence.
Occasionally, we've been forced to accept candidates with minor shortcomings, but nothing that would prohibit someone from working in a field such as law enforcement, for example. But now there are enough of the right kind of people to warrant a new measuring stick, bodies with minds to match, essential, as we push out further and further.
Yet you still closely monitor performance.
We have to ensure that people are meeting their potential.
And exceeding.
No one exceeds his potential.
If he did?
It would simply mean that we did not accurately gauge his potential in the first place.
Are you all right, Jerome?
Terrific.
So Ethan Hawke obviously doesn't have a heart that can run through buildings like his DNA donor does, right? And the director there is talking about, right? No one exceeds their potential, he says, right? We can figure out what your potential is. We know exactly what you can do, and no one ever goes above that. If you did, it just means we didn't evaluate you properly in the beginning, right? And I don't know if that's really true or not, of course, right? So we've got these all these sayings about I gave 110% or whatever, right? And I mean, there seemingly are people who've exceeded their expectations. This is Spud Webb, right? He's 5'6", an inch taller than I am. And in 1986, he won the NBA Slam Dunk contest, right? That they have during the All-Star, right? He's the shortest person by far that ever won the NBA. Right? There's only been one other person smaller than 6 feet tall that won the NBA Slam Dunk contest. Right? So here's an example of, if you looked at somebody who's 5'6" tall, you wouldn't guess that they would, first of all, make it in the NBA in the first place, and second, be able to win the Slam Dunk contest. Right? So did Spud Webb exceed his potential? I don't know. I'm not sure how to judge that, right? And to bring it back a little more for most of y'all that are students, right? So here at UT, we've got a grading system, as most schools do, right? So the average GPA at UT is 3.0. I desperately tried to find the percentage of students at UT who have a 4.0, and I couldn't. I looked everywhere. So anyway, the average UT GPA is a 3.0. So in other words, there's approximately half people above that, they're half below it, give or take, right? And so, of course, what happens is if you're in a class and you're earning an A, right? You're taking 4 or 5 whatever classes, maybe you have other activities, a job or whatever else is going on, and you get your first exam back and you make an A and you feel like you're making an A in the class, well then you realize, well, I can back off a little bit, right? I can pay less attention to this class and maybe learn less from this class and put more attention to other things, right? So when you've got to your potential, oh, you're earning an A in this class, then we feel like, well, good, I don't have to work as hard in this class anymore, right? I've reached where I'm supposed to be. I'm being rewarded with that by getting an A. But the flip side is maybe you've got the potential to learn so much more from that class, right? But because you're being rewarded with that A, you say, well, that's okay, I'm done, right? I can do other things and spend my time doing other things and attention other places, right? And not have to worry so much about that grade and what's going on in that class because I've been rewarded with this A. Sure.
Okay. I'm going to make a quick announcement. So, because we had this technical difficulty and it's taking me so long to queue up each of the scenes, he's having to, spin it out while I find the way to the scene. And that's put us pretty close to the stated end time. So if you did have to leave at sharp at 7 and you need to be someplace, would you please fill out your feedback form before you go? Now, we don't have that much more to the program, and I think it's been fascinating. I hope that you can all stay and help yourselves to some refreshments. But if you are needing to leave, please at least do fill out the feedback form for us and just leave the form and the pencil in your chair. Please take some food on your way out and then join us next time, and I'll get us now to our next clip and we'll continue, okay?
Oh, so my job's to set it up, right? So as the Ethan Hawke character and Uma Thurman's character, as their romance develops, they go on a date.
Oh, I'm going to...
Number 14, right?
Yeah.
So even in the near future, apparently, people still go on dates. So they go to see a piano concert, and what we'll see is that there's something a little special about the piano player.
You didn't know?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Wonderful, wasn't it?
12 fingers are one, it's how you play.
That piece can only be played to 12.
All right, so now we see something a little different than what we saw at the beginning of the movie. There, we were trying to eliminate defects, get people, right, who didn't have heart problems. The Ethan Hawke character, I don't think I've mentioned this, has a heart problem in the movie. That's why they won't let him be an astronaut. Sorry, way to skip that part. I know it's one of my favorite parts. So anyway, so now we see for the piano player, they've actually chosen somebody who has special characteristics. Instead of 10 fingers, he's got 12. Right? And so now we have music that can only be played with 12 fingers, or maybe with an assistant. So, right, so now we get into this starting of the dark side of, well, right, we're not just choosing to get rid of bad characteristics, now we're trying to choose the good characteristics. And I'm not purposefully picking on China, but this is currently one of these places where it's happening most obviously. So, because of the one-child policy in China, lots of families there want males and not females. And so what's happened is they're choosing to have male babies, and it's skewing the male to female ratio. So in much of the world, we have about 1.05 males at birth for every one female. And in China, that's being skewed. There's many more males in China now than there are in females, right? So even with sort of low technology, all right, people are being able to choose what sex child they want, and in China, more people are choosing males than females. All right? So why would you do this? Well, they did a study and they looked at salaries based on people's heights. And what they found is that for each inch that you're taller than average height, they looked in the US and Canada, I believe, they said it was worth $789 a year for every inch taller you were than average. All right? So if you want your child to be successful and have a lot of money, well, choose a tall child. They'll earn more money. Right? So first we're going to try to get rid of defects. Then we start choosing, well, what traits do we want? What traits do we don't want? Okay. So this scene goes back to the beginning of the movie where once again Vincent, we're seeing some scenes from his childhood where he, as the godchild, and then his brother, who was designed. And so we've got this idea of these sort of self-fulfilling categorizations, right? They know who's who. And they have this game they play where they go out and swim.
When our parents weren't watching, we used to swim as far out as we dared. It was about who would get scared and turn back first. Of course, it was always me. Anton was by far the stronger swimmer, and he had no excuse to fail.
Right. So this idea that once you know that you're new and improved, right? So we have these sort of characterizations of who's who and what's going to happen, and